Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about another iPhone that came out not too long ago. It came out in 2018, and when it originally came out, it was a very polarizing iPhone, but it wasn't a bad iPhone by any means. It was actually a very, very good one, and I think it's one of the most important things that Apple's done for the iPhone lineup is creating a consistent, cheaper model along with their most expensive premium models. Before, they kind of did things like with the 5C and the 5S, and maybe with like the iPhone SE and the iPhone 6S, but those weren't really like the great iPhones. I mean, they were kind of like a watered down model of the bigger ones they had for not that much cheaper, except for the iPhone SE. But with the iPhone XR, they made their own dedicated phone for this specific type that was going to be consistent forever. And I think for sure the iPhone XR deserves a lot of credit there. And it's going to be turning 3 years old this year, which is so insane. I still feel like it just came out. So let's go and see how this phone holds up in 2021. I will tell you the price tag is one of the best aspects of this phone. So I'll go ahead and leave this one linked down below, but I'll also leave maybe like a couple other iPhones that I might deem, appropriate in the same kind of category. I'll leave those down in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now the front of the iPhone XR still has that 6.1 inch liquid retina IPS panel. And at the time of its release, you guys already know, a lot of people including me weren't really happy about it, but it's definitely grown on me. And I don't really think there's like a huge problem with this type of panel. I think the biggest problem I have with it nowadays may be the bezel and the notch. Considering the fact though that the iPhone 12 Pro Max and the 12 Pro still have it, I think it makes it feel a little bit, still up to date. But I really hope, once Apple goes ahead and removes that notch, it's going to make these phones feel so much older, like immediately. It's going to be so funny. But the panel is pretty good. You still have True Tone on it. You have the gesture-based design, and it's not a problem. I think the bezel is not really that big of a deal. I don't think the notch is a huge deal right now. But like I said, once Apple removes it, it's going to definitely make these phones feel that much older. On the bottom, you have the Lightning port, which is awesome. And on the back, you have the glass back with wireless charging, which is awesome. And overall, this phone still feels really premium in the hand. It doesn't feel cheap. You have IP certification on this phone as well. So it's pretty durable. And I actually, funny enough, the iPhone XR, the blue one that I had, I actually did accidentally end up throwing it away by accident. I don't even know how I did it. I think when I filmed my April Fool's video, I had a trash bag out and I was doing some crazy stuff. And it was just kind of like a skit, but I actually ended up throwing away, I think, my iPhone XR by accident. So I had to go buy another one, but it's totally okay. But on top of the iPhone XR's back, you do have that single camera setup, which we'll go ahead and hit on right now. It has a single 12 megapixel sensor, and actually, it's a pretty good single camera setup. At that time, I went ahead and compared it to pretty much every single iPhone and any other phone for the matter that I actually had at that time. And for the most part, it was a really good, compelling camera for sure. Compared to pretty much every single iPhone that I had at the time, the camera was actually much better than the other ones. It just kind of sucked because it didn't have an extra sensor. It didn't have that telephoto or ultra wide sensor that the newer iPhones had or the XS had with the telephoto lens. But I still think for a lot of things that you would do, it's okay for the most part. You know what I mean? In terms of the single camera, it's really not that big of a deal, but the quality of the single camera is still really good. You still have basically almost all the features that the newer iPhones have on this specific back camera, which I think is awesome. You can do 4K at 60 as well, which is another huge improvement. I think that in and of itself is still something that future-proofs this iPhone when you consider the fact that the 12 Pro, the 12 Pro Max still can only do 4K at 60. I think that makes this phone feel that much, still up to date for the most part. However, the front camera may be a little bit more of a problem. So it's a single 7 megapixel camera as well. Now, I think the bigger problem with this is that you can only do 1080p at 60 frames, which I think 60 frames at 1080p is still really good. And I actually do think the front camera of this phone is still extremely good for the most part. But because we now have, like 4K at 60 and all these other frame rates that we can film in, that really does kind of take a toll on this specific camera. So it's definitely not a bad camera by any means, but because we are in this phase of getting 4K at 60 consistently on like every single iPhone camera, but most other phones that have been coming out besides like OnePlus and some Xiaomi phones, it really doesn't make this phone feel that much older. As much as I hate to say it, that does kind of seem to be the case. So the back camera is still like a 9 out of 10. The front camera is more like a 6.5 out of 10 in today's standard. So that really pretty much covers it up in the camera standpoint. Now, software wise, This is again one of this phone's biggest assets for sure. This phone originally came out with iOS 12. It's gotten iOS 14. It's going to be getting iOS 15, 16, 17, and maybe even more. I'm not really too sure. So this phone's longevity in the life cycle is still here. It's not like you're going to pick up this phone today and feel like you have an outdated phone by any means. This is still going to be a consistently fast phone and a consistently smooth phone because of the software. So as long as this thing's getting software, experience and software updates and fixes, this thing's still going to be a good phone for the most part. I would probably even still be recommending this phone even when it's done getting software support, and that's like 3 years away from now. So, and even when it's done getting full OS support, it may still get supplemental updates with, iOS 16.5 or whatever updates when it originally comes out. So in terms of software, 10 out of 10, still perfect for me in my opinion. Now performance wise, this is another area of this phone where it's just still so good and there's so little to complain about. So it has that Apple A12 Bionic chip inside of it, the hexa-core CPU with 3 gigabytes of RAM. Now again, this is a 2018 phone. It's not super old, it's barely 3 years old. It's more like 2.5. And I can definitely tell you, the phone is still extremely accessible when it comes down to the performance of it. It's a really, really good performing phone. Anything you're going to do with it, it's going to be able to handle it perfectly fine. So day-to-day tasks, things that I would explain to my day-to-day, going through Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, multitasking, but doing stuff, checking emails, checking YouTube stuff, overall, it handles those things perfectly fine. For daily things, you're not really going to see that big of a difference from an iPhone XR to an iPhone 12 Pro. I think the biggest problem and differentiating factor between an iPhone XR and something like an iPhone 12 Pro or 12 Pro Max is going to come in the RAM management. This phone has half the amount of RAM as the iPhone 12 Pro. So what that basically means is that if you're able to hold, 100 apps in the background of the iPhone 12 Pro and without, hanging out and without any apps like reloading and stuff, you can only do 50 apps on the iPhone XR. Now there's 2 different ways to look at it. One person would look at it and be like, wow, the iPhone 12 Pro is twice as good as it, and that makes it that much better of a deal. But most people, I think even me included, will look at the iPhone XR and be like, well, 50 apps is still really, really good, even though it doesn't have 100. 50 apps is more than enough of what I use. I only use 15 or 20. So yeah, the iPhone XR is still perfectly fine. That's kind of how I would look at it. And I think the iPhone XR in that standpoint is still a really good multitasking phone. It's not perfect and it's definitely not its strong suit. I would probably rate that specific aspect maybe a 6.5 to 7 out of 10. But because this thing is an iOS device, it doesn't have a crazy amount of background processors running in. It's still a very smooth device. It's still fast enough for pretty much everything you're going to do. And it's far cheaper than a lot of the competition. So I'll definitely tell you the performance of this phone is a strong suit, and it definitely gets a thumbs up from me in my books. Now ending it off with the battery life, this device does have that 2,942 mAh battery inside of it. And I still think after iOS 14 and all these other woes, the battery life of this iPhone XR is still good enough for a lot of people out there. Is it perfect? I actually don't even think it's that bad. Compared to the iPhone 12, I think this phone has really good battery life. However, compared to the iPhone XR and iOS 14, there are some problems there because it still has hindered a lot of what the battery life I was expecting from iOS, 14, because on iOS 13 and 12 was perfectly fine. But after my battery comparisons, I did find that iOS 14 took a huge toll on the battery life. The iPhone XR did not last as long as the iPhone 12, but it's still perfectly fine because I know over time iOS 14 is going to get better. And if I were to retest it now, it would probably end up being a little bit better overall. So in terms of the battery life, I'll say it's pretty good still. Even iOS 14 kind of messed it up a little bit. So in terms of battery life, that pretty much covers it up. Now to kind of sum up this video and say answer the question, is the iPhone XR still worth it in 2021? Well, let me start off by telling you some of the pros and of some of the cons. There's not really a lot of cons if I'm being honest. The panel of this phone is still pretty okay. It's not a hugely huge advantage of it, but it's definitely not a bad thing. I think the panel is overall a net positive. You have Face ID, which is still pretty much the same thing we have going on now. You have the Lightning port, which is I guess a Pro, it doesn't really matter. You have the glass back, which still feels very premium with wireless charging and IP certification. So this phone still feels and performs extremely well when it comes down to the body. And it doesn't look old because all the other iPhones still pretty much look old just the same way. It's definitely not a crazy good design, but all the other iPhones look like this, so there's nothing really we can say about it. You do have a really, really good back-facing camera. The back-facing camera, even though it's only a single camera setup, is still a really good single camera for the most part. And I feel like with the, software improvements that we've been getting, it's actually been helping out the camera quite a bit as well. So the performance is still amazing on this phone. It's definitely not slow and it doesn't feel like a slow phone at all. and the battery life is still pretty okay. But there are a few cons, like I stated. The front camera definitely does feel a little bit more dated compared to what we have nowadays. It is only a single camera on the back as well, no telephoto or ultra wide, so that will make this phone feel a little bit more dated. So that's kind of like another minor area. The screen is an OLED, it's an IPS panel, so some people may not like that or prefer that. But I think, like I said, this is a good enough panel for the most part, and I really don't think people are going to complain too much about that. And those are really the main areas. I think probably when it comes down to it, for the price tag of this phone, and for, the 3 years that it's been out almost, this is a crazy good phone still for the value. I can't name really many other phones for this type of value that's, this good. Maybe the iPhone 10 because it's just a little bit cheaper, but this phone is still a killer phone for the most part, and I would highly recommend as many people as you want to go ahead and pick up this phone. This is a really, really good phone for the value. So that really pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.